Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling like you lost, even though you said everything you needed to say? That hollow sensation in your chest, that knot forming in your throat, that quiet rage building because someone spoke over you, dismissed you, or made you feel small with their words. And maybe in that moment, you stayed quiet. Maybe you chose not to engage. Maybe you held back your response, swallowed your anger, and simply left. And then came the thoughts, the replaying of the conversation, the perfect responses you could have given, the cutting remarks you should have made, the ways you could have won if only you'd fought harder, spoken louder, pushed back more forcefully. You beat yourself up for staying silent. You labeled your restraint as weakness. You convinced yourself that not reacting meant surrendering, that choosing silence was the same as choosing defeat. But what if everything you believe about silence is completely wrong? What if the moments you felt weakest were actually when you were strongest? What if your silence, the very thing you've been ashamed of, is the most devastating weapon you possess? This audiobook will challenge everything modern culture has taught you about power, communication, and control, because we live in a world that worships noise. Volume equals strength. Talking equals winning. Explaining equals being right. The loudest voice dominates. The quickest comeback wins. The person who can argue longest proves their point. This is the religion of modern discourse, and it's built on a fundamental lie. Friedrich Nietzsche, one of history's most misunderstood philosophers, saw through this illusion. He understood something that most people never grasp. Those who talk too much reveal too much. Those who need to convince others are already at a disadvantage. The person desperately defending their position has already lost the true battle, the battle for self-mastery. Because real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. Real power exists in the space between words, in the pregnant pause, in the deliberate withholding, in the strategic absence of response. Society conditions us to believe we must fight for every point, defend every opinion, correct every misunderstanding, prove every claim, as if every conversation is a courtroom and we're constantly on trial, as if silence equals admission of guilt, as if not responding means we have no response. But Nietzsche proposed something radically different. The superior individual doesn't engage in these theatrical performances. They observe from a position of complete self-possession. They understand that most arguments aren't about truth at all. They're about ego, about the desperate need to be right, to be validated, to be seen as intelligent or moral or worthy. And when you recognize this pattern, when you see through the performance, everything changes. Because suddenly you are no longer a participant in their game. You're watching it from outside. You're the chess player, while everyone else is a piece on the board. Your silence becomes a mirror that forces others to confront themselves. And most people can't handle what they see in that reflection. This audiobook is for those who constantly feel overlooked, dismissed, or invalidated in conversations. For those who leave interactions feeling unheard despite saying everything they needed to say. For those who've been labeled as too quiet, or hard to read, or intimidating simply because they don't participate in the constant noise. For those who are exhausted from being the reasonable one, the calm one, the one who avoids conflict while others exploit that patience. Perhaps you've confused your natural inclination towards silence with weakness. Perhaps you've been told that speaking up is always the right choice. That silence is complicity. That withholding your thoughts is dishonest. But what if these messages were designed to keep you weak? What if making you doubt your silence was a way to control you? What if your instinct to remain quiet was actually wisdom your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet? Over the next chapters, we'll explore Nietzsche's philosophy of power through silence, how the reactive mind is a controlled mind, how the observing mind is the dangerous one, how silence acts as both shield and sword, how it unsettles, destabilizes, and ultimately dominates without ever needing to explain itself. You'll learn to distinguish between the silence of submission and the silence of mastery, between remaining quiet out of fear and choosing silence as a strategic weapon. We'll examine the concept of the Übermensch, Nietzsche's ideal of the superior human who transcends conventional morality and operates from a place of complete self-control. This isn't about becoming cruel or cold. It's about becoming sovereign, about reclaiming the power you've been giving away every time you felt compelled to respond, to justify, to explain yourself to people who haven't earned that explanation. You'll discover why manipulators panic when met with silence, why narcissists rage when their provocations receive no reaction, why control freaks lose composure when their games meet stillness. Because all manipulation depends on your response. All emotional control requires your participation. And when you withhold that participation, the entire dynamic collapses. The manipulator stands exposed. The narcissist reveals their emptiness. The control freak loses the only power they ever had, the power to make you react. But this journey requires brutal honesty. Because if you're truly committed to understanding power through silence, you must first confront an uncomfortable question. Are you choosing silence strategically? Or are you being silenced? Are you withholding response from a position of strength? Or are you suppressing yourself from a position of fear? Because there's a vast difference between the silence of the Übermensch and the silence of the oppressed. One commands respect. The other invites exploitation. Many people confuse these two forms of silence. They endure mistreatment, swallow their anger, accept disrespect, and call it keeping the peace. They let others dominate conversations, spaces, and relationships while convincing themselves that not fighting back is spiritual maturity. But Nietzsche would call this what it truly is: slave morality. The value system of those who've been conditioned to accept their own subjugation and feel virtuous for doing so. If you've been living this way, if you've been confusing submission with wisdom, this audiobook will be uncomfortable. It will challenge the narratives you've built to justify your passivity. It will force you to admit that perhaps you've been giving away power, not because you're enlightened, but because you're afraid. Afraid of conflict, afraid of judgment, afraid of being disliked. And that fear has been dressed up as virtue for so long that you've forgotten its fear at all. But here's the promise. If you can face this truth, if you can distinguish between strategic silence and fearful suppression, you will access a form of power most people never discover. A power that doesn't depend on others' reactions. A power that grows stronger the more you cultivate it. A power that transforms your presence so completely that words become almost unnecessary. Your silence will speak volumes. Your stillness will command attention. Your refusal to engage will become more impactful than any argument you could construct. This is not a guide to avoiding confrontation. It's a manual for dominating confrontation without appearing to participate in it. It's not about becoming passive. It's about becoming strategically active in ways that fly beneath the radar of conscious awareness. When you master this approach, people won't understand why you become so influential. They'll sense something has changed, but won't be able to articulate what. You'll have gained the upper hand in every interaction while appearing to have done nothing at all. The weak shout. The strong remain silent. The wise choose when to do each. And after completing this audiobook, you'll understand not just how to be silent, but why your silence is the most sophisticated weapon in your arsenal. Why it unsettles others at a psychological level they can't articulate. Why it forces introspection, reveals weakness, and establishes dominance without ever needing to claim it. Are you ready to see silence in a completely new light? Not as the absence of response, but as the most definitive response possible? not as weakness, but as the ultimate expression of strength? Then let's begin this journey into Nietzschean power dynamics. Let's discover how to win every battle by never appearing to fight. Let's learn to master others by first mastering ourselves. The path forward is silent, but it's anything but empty. Why do you feel that burning compulsion to correct someone when they're wrong? That almost physical need to set the record straight, to clarify the misunderstanding, to make sure everyone knows the truth? That urgency rising in your chest when someone misrepresents your position or attributes beliefs to you that you don't hold. That itch to defend yourself when criticized, even when the criticism comes from someone whose opinion shouldn't matter. The answer reveals more about you than you probably want to admit. That need to respond, that compulsion to engage, that inability to let things go. It's not coming from strength. It's erupting from the most fragile part of your psyche, your ego. And a fragile ego is a controlled ego. The moment someone can reliably trigger a response from you, they own you. Not obviously, not overtly, but effectively. Nietzsche understood this with brutal clarity. He saw that most human communication isn't about exchanging ideas or discovering truth. It's about something far more primitive. Establishing dominance, securing validation, defending territory. When someone argues with you, what are they really doing? Are they genuinely seeking to understand your perspective? Or are they trying to confirm their existing worldview? To prove they're right? To demonstrate their intelligence? To establish their position in the social hierarchy? Honest reflection reveals an uncomfortable truth. Most arguments are ego battles disguised as intellectual discourse. The content almost doesn't matter. What matters is winning, being right, not appearing foolish, maintaining the carefully constructed self-image each person has built. And every time you engage in these battles, every time you feel compelled to respond, you're admitting something crucial. You still need others' approval. You still require external validation of your worth, your intelligence, your righteousness. This is what Nietzsche called slave morality. Not slavery in a literal sense, but psychological slavery. The condition of those who measure themselves against others, who need consensus to feel secure in their beliefs, who require agreement to feel validated in their positions. Slave morality is the value system of people who've outsourced their sense of self to the crowd, who check with others before forming opinions, who speak in order to be accepted rather than to express genuine truth. Think about the last time someone said something you knew was incorrect. That immediate reaction, that urge to correct them, where did it come from? Was it from a noble desire to spread accurate information? Or was it from ego? From the need to be seen as the smart one, the informed one, the one who knows better? Be honest, because that honesty is the first step toward freedom. When you feel compelled to correct, to explain, to defend, you're broadcasting a message to everyone present. My sense of self is so fragile that I cannot allow inaccurate information to stand unchallenged. I need you to know that I know better. I need this small victory to maintain my self-image. That's not strength. That's desperation. And everyone subconsciously recognizes it, even if they can't articulate what they're sensing. Compare this to someone who hears incorrect information and simply doesn't react, doesn't correct, doesn't engage. They know the truth. They're secure in that knowledge, and they don't need anyone else to acknowledge it. That person is operating from a completely different psychological foundation. They're not measuring themselves against others. They're not seeking validation. They're not playing the game everyone else is trapped in. And that makes them dangerous. Because the person who doesn't need to be right is the person who can't be manipulated through their ego, can't be baited into arguments, can't be controlled through provocations, can't be diminished through dismissal. When your sense of self doesn't depend on others' recognition, You become functionally immune to the primary weapons people use to control each other, making you doubt yourself, making you defend yourself, making you prove yourself. This immunity is what Nietzsche saw in his concept of the Übermensch, not someone who dominates through force or volume, but someone who's transcended the need to dominate at all. Someone who's so secure in their own evaluation of reality that others' disagreements become irrelevant, not offensive, not challenging, just irrelevant. Like a mountain doesn't care about the opinion of those hiking it. But reaching this level requires confronting an uncomfortable truth. Every time you've argued, defended, explained, or justified yourself, you've been feeding the very weakness that enslaves you. You've been reinforcing the neural pathways that tie your sense of worth to others' acknowledgement. You've been training yourself to be reactive, to be controlled, to be dependent on external validation for internal peace. And the world has been conditioning you toward this dependency your entire life. Society needs reactive people, manageable people, people who can be provoked into predictable responses, people who argue, explain, defend, justify, because reactive people are controllable people. They can be herded, manipulated, dominated through their own psychological triggers. Breaking free from this pattern requires recognizing it first. Start noticing how often you feel compelled to respond, how frequently you correct others, how regularly you engage in arguments about things that don't actually matter. Notice the sensation that arises when someone is wrong and you don't correct them. That discomfort, that itch, that feeling that something is incomplete or unresolved. That sensation is your ego screaming for validation. And learning to sit with that discomfort without acting on it is the beginning of power. Because here's what happens when you stop responding. Initially, it feels like losing, feels like backing down, feels like letting them win. Your ego will generate all kinds of justifications for why you should engage. Someone might believe their lies. They'll think I have no counter-argument. Silence looks like agreement. These thoughts will arise powerfully, and they're all ego, all weakness, all the voice of someone who still needs others' approval to feel whole. But if you can resist that urge, if you can sit with the discomfort and remain silent, something shifts. First in you, then in the dynamic itself. You begin to notice that most arguments resolve themselves without your input. The incorrect information either gets corrected by someone else or simply doesn't matter. The person attacking you eventually exhausts themselves. The provocation falls flat, and you remain untouched because you never engaged your emotional energy in the interaction. More importantly, you start to feel the power of self-possession, the quiet strength that comes from knowing you don't need to prove anything to anyone. The liberation of not caring whether others understand you, or agree with you, or acknowledge your rightness. This isn't apathy. It's transcendence. It's moving beyond the petty games of ego that occupy most people's entire existence. And others sense this shift. They might not understand it consciously, but they feel it. Suddenly you're harder to manipulate, harder to provoke, harder to control. Your silence in situations where others expect argument becomes unsettling to them. They don't know what to do with someone who won't play the game. And in their confusion, their discomfort, their attempts to pull you back into reactivity, they reveal themselves. They show you exactly how much they were depending on your response to maintain their own sense of position. This is where strategic silence begins, not in passivity, but in the recognition that your need to respond is your weakness, that every compulsive reaction is a string someone else can pull. That true power lies not in having the best argument, but in not needing to argue at all. When you reach this understanding, genuinely internalize it, you stop being a puppet whose strings others can pull. You become the observer, The one who watches the theater of ego playing out around you without feeling compelled to join the performance. Does this mean never speaking? Never expressing your thoughts? Never correcting falsehoods? No. It means speaking becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. Correcting happens strategically rather than reactively. Engaging occurs because you've decided it serves your purpose, not because someone successfully provoked you into it. The difference is subtle but transformative. One comes from weakness, from need, from fear of how silence will be interpreted. The other comes from power, from choice, from complete indifference to how others interpret your actions. And make no mistake, this path is difficult, because everything in your conditioning resists it. Your ego will stage rebellions, will convince you that particular situations absolutely require your response, will make you feel like remaining silent is cowardice rather than strength. You will need to challenge these thoughts repeatedly, examine them, recognize them as the voice of weakness rather than wisdom. But each time you successfully resist the compulsion to respond, you strengthen the part of yourself that the world can't control. You build the foundation of what Nietzsche called the will to power, not power over others, but power over yourself. And that's the only power that truly matters. Chapter 2. The reactive mind is a subjugated mind. There's a simple test for whether you're truly free or just wearing the costume of freedom. Can you be silent when everything in you wants to speak? Can you withhold reaction when provocation demands response? Can you observe without participating? If you can't, if your mind automatically generates reactions to stimuli, if your emotions dictate your responses, then you're not free. You're a machine. A predictable, programmable machine that anyone who understands your triggers can operate remotely. This is the uncomfortable truth Nietzsche forces us to confront. Most people believe they're making conscious choices, thinking independent thoughts, acting from authentic desires. But observation reveals something else entirely. Most human behavior is reaction. Someone insults you, you defend. Someone challenges your beliefs, you argue. Someone ignores you, you seek attention. Someone praises you, you glow. Someone criticizes you, you wither. You're not acting, you're reacting. And the reactive mind is a controlled mind. Think about the implications of this. If someone knows your triggers, if someone understands what makes you angry, what makes you defensive, what makes you eager to prove yourself, then that person can control you. Not through force, not through authority, through manipulation of your own predictable responses. They press the button. You perform the action. Again and again. A perfect mechanical relationship where you're the machine and they're the operator. This is how most human relationships function at a level nobody wants to admit. Marriages where partners know exactly which buttons to press to start fights. Workplaces where colleagues understand how to trigger insecurity or competitiveness. Families where everyone has mastered the art of provoking specific reactions from specific people. Social groups where manipulation has become so normalized that nobody even recognizes it's happening anymore. And the tragedy is that the reactive person believes they're standing up for themselves, believes they're being authentic, believes they're refusing to be pushed around. But they're doing the opposite. They're demonstrating that they can be pushed around quite easily. They're proving that their behavior can be predicted and controlled simply by knowing which stimulus produces which response. They're broadcasting their weakness while feeling strong. Nietzsche saw this pattern everywhere in human society. He saw people who thought they were acting from principle when they were actually reacting from conditioning. People who believed they were defending truth when they were actually protecting ego. People who imagined they were being authentic when they were actually being puppets dancing on strings they couldn't see. And he had no respect for this condition, not because he was cruel, but because he valued strength, real strength, the strength of self-mastery. And self-mastery begins with breaking the stimulus-response patterns that govern most human behavior. So what does the non-reactive mind look like? It's not a mind that never responds. It's a mind that responds from choice rather than compulsion, that observes the stimulus, notices the automatic reaction beginning to form, and then decides consciously whether to express it or not. This pause, this gap between stimulus and response, this is where freedom lives, where power resides, where you stop being a machine and become a conscious agent. Creating this gap requires practice, requires catching yourself in the moment of reaction, requires noticing the anger rising, the defensiveness activating, the need to correct emerging, and pausing before acting on these impulses. Initially, you'll catch yourself only after you've already reacted. That's fine. That's progress. You're bringing unconscious patterns into consciousness. Keep practicing. Eventually, you'll catch the reaction as it's happening, then before it happens. And finally, you'll reach a state where reactions arise as information rather than as commandments. The anger comes. You notice it. You acknowledge it. And then you decide whether expressing it serves your purposes or not. This is sovereignty. This is self-possession. This is freedom in the only sense that matters. Freedom from your own automatic patterns. Because external freedom means nothing if you're internally enslaved to your reactions. You might not be in a literal prison, but you're trapped nonetheless if any random person can control your emotional state by saying the right words or displaying the right behaviors. Consider how much emotional energy gets wasted on reactions. Someone says something offensive. Your day is ruined. Someone disagrees with you. You spend hours mentally arguing. Someone ignores you. You obsess over why. Someone challenges your competence. You work twice as hard to prove them wrong. Look at this pattern. Look at how much of your energy, your focus, your mental resources are being directed by others. They set the agenda. They determine your emotional state. They control your attention. And you think you're free? Breaking this pattern requires a ruthless commitment to self-observation. You must begin to notice your reactions as they happen. Notice the anger. Notice the hurt. Notice the need to prove yourself. Notice the urge to correct. And most importantly, notice that these reactions are just reactions. They're not truth. They're not mandatory. They're not who you are. They're patterns, habits, conditioning, and patterns can be changed. But here's where most people get stuck. They believe that not reacting means suppressing, means pushing down their anger, swallowing their hurt, denying their feelings. This isn't what we're discussing. Suppression is just another form of reactivity, just directed inward instead of outward. What we're talking about is transmutation, allowing the reaction to arise, acknowledging it fully, and then choosing consciously what to do with that energy. When someone insults you and you feel anger rising, the reactive path is to lash out. The suppressive path is to push it down and pretend you're not angry. The sovereign path is to feel the anger, recognize it as information about your ego's vulnerabilities, and then decide whether expressing it serves your goals or not. Maybe it does. Maybe a strategic expression of anger is useful. But now you're choosing. You're not being controlled by the emotion. You're using it as tool rather than being used by it. This distinction changes everything. Because now you're no longer at the mercy of your own psychology. You're working with it, directing it, mastering it. And mastery of self is what makes mastery of circumstances possible. Because circumstances can only control you through your reactions to them. The circumstance itself is neutral. Your interpretation and reaction is what creates suffering or strength. When you realize this at a bone-deep level, when you genuinely internalize that your reactions are choices rather than inevitabilities, you become dangerous in the best possible way. Dangerous because you can no longer be manipulated through provocation. can no longer be controlled through emotional triggering, can no longer be predicted and managed through understanding your buttons. You've unplugged the control panel. The buttons are still there, but they're not connected to anything. Someone pushes them expecting the usual response. Nothing happens. They push harder. Still nothing. They escalate, trying to force the reaction they've come to depend on for maintaining their position in the relationship. And you remain still, observing, choosing, sovereign. This is what terrifies manipulators. This is what destabilizes power dynamics built on emotional control. This is what transforms you from a piece on the board to a player of the game. And once you've experienced this level of self-possession, returning to reactivity becomes unthinkable, not because you're suppressing, but because you've tasted genuine freedom and everything else feels like slavery by comparison. The reactive mind is a subjugated mind, the observing mind, the mind that watches reactions arise and then consciously decides whether to act on them. That's the dangerous mind. That's the free mind. That's the mind Nietzsche envisioned when he wrote about the Übermensch. Not someone who never feels emotions. Someone who's mastered them. Not someone who never responds. Someone who responds from choice rather than compulsion. And that makes all the difference between being controlled and being sovereign. Between being a puppet and being a master, between being weak and being truly, genuinely, undeniably strong. Chapter 3. Silence is a mirror that reveals others' truth. Silence does something extraordinary that most people never consciously recognize. It creates space. And in that space, people reveal themselves completely, not intentionally, not strategically, but inevitably. Because nature abhors a vacuum, and human psychology abhors silence even more. When you withhold the expected response, when you refuse to fill the conversational space, something fascinating happens. The other person starts filling it, and what they fill it with tells you everything you need to know about who they actually are beneath their social mask. This is why silence is such a devastating tool for seeing truth. Not truth in some abstract philosophical sense, but practical truth about the person in front of you, their insecurities, their manipulations, their genuine thoughts versus their performed thoughts, their real agenda versus their stated agenda. All of this comes pouring out when they're forced to speak into silence rather than speaking into the back and forth of normal conversation. Watch what happens when someone is talking and expects agreement, validation, or engagement, and instead receives only your quiet attention. Initially, they might not notice. They're too focused on their performance. But as the silence extends, as you offer no confirming nods, no verbal agreements, no reactions that signal you're on their side, something shifts in them. They become uncertain. They start speaking faster, adding more justifications, providing evidence you didn't ask for, explaining things that don't need explanation. Why? Because your silence is forcing them to question whether their position is as solid as they thought, whether their argument is as compelling as they believed, whether they're as convincing as they need to be. Your silence isn't challenging them with counter-arguments. It's doing something far more powerful. It's making them challenge themselves. And most people's positions can't withstand that kind of internal scrutiny, which is why most people avoid it through constant talking. This is where Nietzsche's observation about truth becomes relevant. He argued that most of what people call truth is actually just opinion that's never been seriously questioned. Beliefs inherited from culture, family, social groups, never examined, never tested, simply accepted because everyone else accepts them. And these unexamined beliefs can only survive in an environment of mutual reinforcement, where everyone nods along, where disagreements are immediately met with rebuttals, where silence never gets a chance to create the space necessary for genuine reflection. But when you introduce silence into this dynamic, when you withhold the reinforcement, the house of cards begins to wobble. Suddenly the person has to actually think about what they're saying rather than just saying it, has to actually believe it rather than performing belief, has to actually examine whether their position makes sense rather than just assuming it does, because nobody's challenged it. And this examination, this forced confrontation with the potential emptiness of their stated position, this is what your silence creates. More than revealing truth about positions, silence reveals truth about character. Notice how different people respond to sustained, attentive silence. Some become anxious, filling every gap with nervous chatter. This reveals insecurity, a need to control the environment through constant verbal output, fear of what might emerge in quiet spaces. Others become aggressive, interpreting silence as judgment or dismissal. This reveals fragility, an inability to exist comfortably without constant affirmation, a personality that requires everyone else to participate in their reality or be labeled as hostile. Still others become reflective, using the space to think more deeply about what they're saying. This reveals security, self-possession, an internal compass that doesn't depend on constant external validation. And some rare individuals match your silence with their own, creating a shared space of comfortable quiet. This reveals kindred spirits, people who've also recognized that constant talking is often just avoidance of genuine connection or genuine thought. All of this information floods toward you when you master the art of sustained silence. You become a psychological diagnostician, able to assess character, motivation, and authenticity simply by withholding response and observing what emerges. This isn't manipulation in the negative sense. It's revelation. You're not making them be anything they're not. You're simply creating conditions where their actual nature shows itself clearly instead of being hidden behind a performance of normal social interaction. But there's another layer to how silence reveals truth. It reveals your truth to you. Because when you stop constantly talking, stop constantly explaining, stop constantly engaging, you create internal space as well as external space. And in that internal space, you start to notice things about yourself. Notice how much of your talking was actually thinking out loud. How many of your expressed opinions were actually just trying on other people's opinions to see how they fit? How much of your identity was constructed through others' reactions to you rather than through your own self-examination? This can be uncomfortable, because many people discover that when they stop performing for others, stop seeking validation through constant expression, stop using conversation as a way to avoid being alone with their own thoughts, they don't actually know who they are. They've been socially constructed. Their personality is just a collection of reactions to others' expectations, opinions that seem to impress people, behaviors that generated positive responses. Take away the audience, and there's disturbingly little substance underneath. But this discomfort, this confrontation with your own lack of genuine self-knowledge, this is necessary. You can't build authentic strength on a foundation of social performance. You can't develop real power if your entire sense of self depends on others' validation. You can't become sovereign if you're actually just a mirror reflecting others' expectations back at them. The silence that reveals others' truth also reveals yours. And if that truth is currently, I don't know who I am without an audience, then that's precisely what needs to be seen, so it can be addressed. Nietzsche's philosophy demands this kind of brutal honesty with yourself, demands that you strip away the comfortable lies, the social performances, the borrowed beliefs, and see what's actually there. Most people never do this because the prospect is terrifying. What if there's nothing there? What if you remove all the borrowed parts and discover you're empty? But here's the insight. You're not empty. You're undiscovered. There's a genuine you beneath all the social conditioning. But finding that genuine self requires periods of sustained silence. Both external silence, where you stop performing for others, and internal silence, where you stop performing for yourself. As you develop this practice of silence as revelation, you'll notice yourself becoming more discerning about people, about situations, about yourself. You'll see manipulation before it hooks you, because you've learned to recognize the patterns that emerge when people talk into silence. You'll spot inauthentic people immediately, because you've learned to distinguish between genuine expression and social performance. You'll understand yourself better, because you've created the space necessary for genuine self-reflection rather than just constant reaction. And here's what makes this particularly powerful. Others can sense when someone sees through them. Not consciously necessarily, but at some level. People recognize when their usual tricks don't work, when their practiced charm bounces off, when their manipulations find no purchase, when their performances receive no applause. Your silence, your ability to simply observe without reacting, makes you a mirror they can't look away from, but also can't stand looking at. Because in that mirror, they see themselves as they actually are rather than as they pretend to be. And for most people, that's an unbearable reflection. This is why mastering silence as a tool of revelation gives you such strategic advantage. You're operating with more complete information than everyone else. You see their insecurities, their manipulations, their authentic self beneath the mask. Meanwhile, they don't see yours because you've stopped revealing yourself through reactive talk. You've become a mystery, an uncertainty, someone they can't quite figure out or predict or control. And that uncertainty, that lack of ability to categorize and manipulate you, that's what transforms your silence from simple non-speaking into genuine power. The kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself, because it's too busy seeing everything clearly while remaining unseen itself. Chapter 4. How Silence Destroys Manipulators Completely. Manipulation functions on a simple principle. The manipulator needs your response, needs your reaction, needs your participation in the dynamic they're creating. Remove any of these elements and the entire mechanism collapses. This is why silence is absolutely lethal to manipulative people. Not because it challenges them directly, which would just give them something to work with, but because it removes the fuel that powers their entire approach to relationships and control. Understanding this requires understanding how manipulation actually works. It's not usually obvious. It's not typically the cartoon villain rubbing their hands together, plotting your downfall. Real manipulation is subtle, psychological, operating below the level of conscious awareness for both the manipulator and the manipulated. It works by making you doubt yourself, making you feel responsible for the manipulator's emotions, making you believe that maintaining the relationship requires constant management of their feelings and needs. And all of this depends completely on your response. The manipulator says something designed to make you feel guilty. You respond with either defense or acquiescence. Either response gives them information and leverage. You defend yourself. They know they've struck a nerve. You acquiesce. They know they've successfully made you responsible for their feelings. Either way, they've gained ground. The manipulation worked. But what happens when the expected response doesn't come? When guilt-tripping meets silence? When passive aggression encounters no reaction? When the manipulator deploys the usual tactics and receives only calm, sustained quiet in return, the entire dynamic short-circuits. Because silence provides nothing to work with. No defensive response to attack. No acquiescence to exploit. No emotional reaction to amplify. Just nothing. And nothing is the most devastating response to manipulation. Watch what happens to manipulators when their tactics meet sustained silence. First comes confusion. This isn't how it's supposed to work. Usually by now, there's a response to manage, an argument to have, an emotional state to exploit. But nothing's happening. The manipulator is talking into a void. This creates uncertainty, which for someone whose entire approach depends on controlling others, is extremely uncomfortable. Next comes escalation. The manipulator tries harder, brings up more serious accusations, deploys more obvious guilt trips, makes more dramatic statements, anything to generate the response that will restore the familiar dynamic, because the silence is revealing something they desperately don't want revealed. Their tactics only work if you participate. You're discovering you don't have to participate, and this discovery is the beginning of their loss of power over you. If silence persists through escalation, what comes next depends on the manipulator's specific psychology. Some become aggressive, attacking the silence itself. You're giving me the silent treatment. Your silence is manipulative. Notice the projection here. The person whose entire approach is manipulation, accusing you of manipulation for simply not responding. This accusation is actually an admission. It's them revealing that your silence is working precisely because it is disrupting their ability to manipulate. Others become pathetic, playing victim even more dramatically, making you feel guilty for not responding, framing your silence as cruelty, as abandonment, as attack. This is a last-ditch attempt to hook you back into responsiveness through a different emotional vector. If guilt doesn't work, maybe compassion will. If accusations don't generate response, maybe appearing wounded will. But it's still manipulation, still an attempt to control your behavior through managing your emotions. And still others simply cannot cope with sustained silence at all. They exit the situation, exit the relationship, declare you cold or cruel or impossible to deal with. And here's the crucial insight. This is a gift. The manipulator removing themselves from your life because you wouldn't participate in your own manipulation. They're doing the work of separation for you. All you had to do was remain silent. All you had to do was refuse to engage. And they couldn't handle it. They exposed themselves completely. Nietzsche understood this dynamic in terms of power and weakness. For him, the strong person is the one who doesn't need others to behave in specific ways, doesn't need validation, agreement, compliance, or even response. The strong person is complete in themselves. But the weak person, the person Nietzsche saw as enslaved to what he called the herd mentality, this person is desperately dependent on others' participation in their reality, needs others to affirm their beliefs, validate their emotions, comply with their demands, respond to their provocations. The manipulator is the ultimate expression of this weakness. Their entire sense of self depends on controlling others' responses. When that control fails, when silence reveals that they never actually had power at all, just the appearance of power that existed only as long as others participated, the manipulator's whole structure collapses. And this collapse is complete precisely because it wasn't caused by direct confrontation, which the manipulator could have countered with more manipulation. It was caused by absence, by nothing, by silence, which leaves nothing to counter, nothing to argue against, nothing to manipulate. This is why learning to recognize manipulation and respond with silence is one of the most powerful skills you can develop. It's not about being cold. It's not about being cruel. It's about refusing to participate in a dynamic that diminishes you. About recognizing that you owe nothing to someone whose entire approach to relationship is based on controlling your responses for their benefit. But implementing this requires overcoming your own conditioning, because manipulators are skilled at making you feel guilty for not responding, at making you feel like your silence is the problem rather than their manipulation, at making you feel responsible for their emotional state. And if you haven't done the internal work of recognizing that you are not responsible for managing other people's emotions, if you haven't internalized that healthy relationships don't require constant responsiveness to provocations, then guilt will pull you back into participation. This is where the distinction between strategic silence and suppression becomes critical. You're not silently taking abuse. You're not suppressing legitimate responses to legitimate concerns. You're identifying manipulation and choosing not to fuel it with your response. You're recognizing power plays and refusing to participate in the game. You're seeing through tactics that have worked before and deciding they won't work anymore. This isn't weakness. This is sovereignty. And as you practice this, as you learn to identify manipulation and meet it with calm silence, you'll notice something extraordinary. The manipulators in your life will either change their approach or remove themselves, because manipulation is exhausting when it doesn't work. Why would a manipulator continue investing energy in tactics that generate no results? They won't. They'll move on to more responsive targets, to people who haven't discovered the power of silence, to relationships where manipulation still functions. This natural filtering effect means that maintaining silence in the face of manipulation doesn't just protect you in the moment. It restructures your entire relational landscape over time. Manipulative people exit. Authentic people, people who don't need you to respond in specific ways, who can handle silence without interpreting it as attack, who relate to you as an autonomous person rather than as a source of validation or control. These people remain or enter your life. But perhaps the most important aspect of using silence against manipulation is what it does for your self-respect. Every time you recognize manipulation and refuse to participate, you're affirming to yourself that you're not a puppet, not a resource to be exploited, not a source of validation for someone else's fragile ego. You're a sovereign individual who chooses engagement rather than being forced into it. And that affirmation, repeated over time, builds a foundation of self-respect that makes future manipulation increasingly impossible. Because ultimately, manipulation only works on people who doubt themselves, who question their perceptions, who can be made to feel guilty for setting boundaries, who can be convinced that the manipulator's emotional state is their responsibility. But when you know, really know at a core level, that you're not responsible for managing others' emotions through compliance, when you've internalized that silence is a legitimate and powerful response to manipulation, when you've experienced the liberation of watching a manipulator's tactics fail because you simply wouldn't engage, you become immune. Not immune to manipulation being attempted, but immune to manipulation working. And that immunity, that complete freedom from a control mechanism that governs so many people's lives, that's what Nietzsche would recognize as strength. Real strength, not the strength of dominating others, but the strength of being immune to domination, the strength of sovereignty, the strength that comes from recognizing that silence is not just an absence of response. Against manipulation, silence is the most devastating response possible, the one that reveals the manipulator completely while revealing nothing about you, the one that preserves your power while destroying theirs, the one that wins by refusing to play the game at all. Chapter 5. The psychology behind why silence unsettles others. There's a reason silence makes people uncomfortable at a visceral level, a reason that goes deeper than social awkwardness or conversational norms. When you remain silent in situations where response is expected, you trigger something primal in the human psyche, something that operates below conscious awareness, but generates intense psychological reactions nonetheless. Understanding this mechanism is understanding why silence is such a powerful tool, because you're not just choosing not to speak. You're activating psychological patterns that most people don't even know they have. The human brain is a prediction machine, constantly forecasting what will happen next based on pattern recognition from past experiences. This prediction happens automatically, below conscious awareness, allowing you to navigate complex social situations without thinking through every interaction step by step. When someone speaks to you, your brain predicts a response. When someone asks a question, your brain predicts an answer. When someone expresses emotion, your brain predicts a corresponding emotional reaction from you. These predictions are so automatic, so deeply wired, that they feel like reality rather than just expectations. But here's what happens when those predictions are violated. The brain experiences prediction error. The expected outcome didn't occur. The pattern broke. And this error triggers an alarm response. Not danger necessarily, but uncertainty. The brain doesn't like uncertainty. Uncertainty means the environment might not be what it thought, might contain variables it hasn't accounted for, might be unpredictable and therefore potentially threatening. So the brain activates the amygdala, the region responsible for processing potential threats, and you experience a cascade of uncomfortable sensations, even though nothing threatening has actually occurred. All of this happens in the other person when you remain silent where response was expected. Their brain predicted your response. Your silence violated that prediction. Prediction error activated their amygdala, and now they're experiencing discomfort, uncertainty, a vague sense that something's wrong even though they can't articulate what. This is the first layer of why silence unsettles. It breaks patterns that people depend on for psychological comfort. But there's a second, deeper layer. Silence forces projection. In the absence of your response, the other person's mind starts generating explanations for your silence. And here's what's crucial. Those explanations almost always come from their own psychology, not from accurate reading of your state. If the person is insecure, they project judgment. They think I'm stupid. They're looking down on me. They think they're better than me. If the person is guilty, they project accusation. They know what I did. They're mad at me. They're planning something. If the person is narcissistic, they project dismissal. They don't care about what I'm saying. They're not paying attention to me. They're disrespecting me. Notice what's happening. Your silence, which is actually neutral, becomes a screen onto which others project their own fears, insecurities, guilts, and neuroses. And they experience these projections as if they're real, as if your silence is actually judgment, accusation, or dismissal rather than simply silence. This is why different people react so differently to the same silence. It's not your silence causing their reaction. It's their own psychology using your silence as a trigger for surfacing unresolved internal material. Nietzsche understood this dynamic even though he didn't have access to modern neuroscience. He knew that most of what people experience as external reality is actually internal projection, that people see what they're prepared to see based on their own psychology, their own fears, their own frameworks. And when you withhold response, when you provide no actual data for them to work with, this projection mechanism goes into overdrive. They have to fill the void with something, and what they fill it with comes entirely from their own psyche. This is why silence is such a powerful diagnostic tool. It reveals what's actually going on in someone's psychology that they might not reveal through normal conversation. The insecure person reveals their insecurity by projecting judgment onto your silence. The manipulator reveals their manipulative intent by becoming agitated when their tactics meet stillness. The narcissist reveals their fragility by raging at perceived dismissal where none occurred. Your silence becomes a psychological X-ray showing bones beneath social flesh. There's also a third layer to why silence unsettles, and this one is even more fundamental. Silence removes the social scaffolding that people use to avoid confronting themselves. Constant conversation, constant engagement, constant interaction. All of this serves a psychological function beyond just communication. It keeps people focused externally, keeps them from turning inward, keeps them from facing uncomfortable aspects of themselves that emerge in quiet. When you maintain silence, especially in situations where the other person is seeking engagement, validation, or response, you force them to confront the gap between their performed self and their actual self, between what they're pretending to be and what they actually are, between their stated beliefs and their genuine uncertainties. This confrontation is deeply uncomfortable for most people, which is exactly why they avoid silence, avoid stillness, avoid moments of genuine introspection where social masks can't be maintained. Your silence, your refusal to participate in the constant external focus that conversation provides, removes their escape route, forces them back into themselves. And for many people, what they find when forced inward is so uncomfortable that they'll do almost anything to escape back into external engagement. This is why some people become almost aggressive in the face of sustained silence. They need you to engage, need you to participate, need the conversation to continue, because without it, they're alone with themselves. And that's unbearable. This is perhaps the deepest reason why silence is powerful. It exposes the fact that most people are running from themselves, using constant talking, constant activity, constant engagement as a way to avoid the confrontation with their own emptiness, their own fears, their own unresolved psychology. When you refuse to participate in this avoidance, when your silence forces them back into themselves, you become threatening not because you're doing anything to them, but because you're removing the mechanism they use to avoid doing something to themselves, genuinely looking inward. The practical application of this understanding is profound. When you see someone becoming agitated, uncomfortable, or hostile in response to your silence, you're not seeing a response to you. You're seeing a response to what your silence is forcing them to confront in themselves. This recognition helps you maintain the silence without feeling guilty or responsible for their discomfort. You're not causing their distress. Their own unresolved psychology is causing it. Your silence is just the catalyst that brought it to the surface. And this is why silence requires inner strength, because the person experiencing all of these uncomfortable reactions to your silence will often try to make you responsible for their discomfort, will blame you for being cold, distant, uncommunicative, manipulative, will try to make you feel guilty for not responding, will project their entire internal chaos onto you and then demand you fix it by breaking your silence. And if you don't have the inner strength to recognize these projections as projections rather than as accurate assessments of your behavior, you'll break. You'll respond. You'll participate. And the moment you do, you've handed back the power you were claiming through silence. But when you understand the psychology behind why silence unsettles, when you recognize that their discomfort is their internal process, not your responsibility, when you see their projections as information about them rather than as truth about you, you can maintain silence without guilt. You can watch the entire psychological process unfold, the prediction error, the projection, the forced self-confrontation, and remain still, unmoved, sovereign. And in that stillness, you're not just refusing to respond. You're demonstrating something far more important, that you're not controlled by others' emotional reactions, that you don't take responsibility for feelings that aren't yours, that you can remain centered while chaos swirls around you. And that kind of demonstration, that lived proof of self-mastery, is what makes silence more than just not talking. It makes silence a declaration of psychological independence that reverberates at levels most people never consciously recognize, but always feel. Chapter 6. Transform silence into a precision weapon. Understanding silence's power intellectually is one thing. Wielding it effectively is another entirely. Because the gap between knowing something and being able to implement it under pressure is where most people fail. You can understand everything we've discussed so far and still find yourself reflexively responding. still get hooked by provocation, still participate in dynamics you consciously want to avoid. This chapter bridges that gap. It transforms understanding into capability through specific, tactical approaches to using silence as a precision weapon. The first tactical principle is this: silence is most powerful when it's selective. If you're silent all the time about everything, you're not strategic. You're just quiet. Strategic silence means choosing specific moments where withholding response achieves specific purposes. This requires you to become very clear about what you want from any given interaction. Do you want to expose someone's manipulation? Do you want to avoid being provoked into an unproductive argument? Do you want to force someone to think more deeply about their position? Do you want to maintain your emotional equilibrium? Different goals require different applications of silence. For exposing manipulation, silence is deployed immediately when manipulation tactics appear. No delay, no tentative half response. The second you recognize a guilt trip, power play, an emotional manipulation, silence descends. Complete, total, sustained. This creates the maximum disruption to the manipulator's tactics and the clearest demonstration that their approach won't work on you. The key here is recognizing manipulation the moment it appears, which requires you've done the internal work of understanding what manipulation looks like rather than just feeling vaguely uncomfortable, but unable to name what's happening. For avoiding provocation, silence is deployed when you feel the urge to respond defensively, that hot sensation rising in your chest, that impulse to correct or defend or justify. That's your signal. Instead of following that impulse, you pause. You feel it fully but don't act on it. This isn't suppression. You're acknowledging the response internally while choosing not to externalize it. This creates space between stimulus and response where you can assess. Is responding going to achieve anything useful? Or will it just feed a dynamic that doesn't serve me? In most cases of provocation, silence is the more powerful choice because engaging validates the provocation as something worthy of your energy. For forcing deeper thought, silence is deployed after someone makes a shallow argument or states something as fact that's actually opinion. Instead of immediately countering with your perspective, you simply look at them attentively and say nothing. This forces them to hear their own words echoing in the space, to reconsider whether what they said is as solid as it sounded in their head, to potentially catch their own logical flaws or unexamined assumptions. Many people, when given the space created by another's silence, will actually talk themselves into questioning their own position. You don't have to argue against it. Your silence creates the environment where they argue against themselves. For maintaining equilibrium, silence is deployed whenever you notice yourself getting emotionally activated. The more you feel pulled toward response, the more important it becomes to pause. This use of silence is primarily for your benefit rather than for external effect. It's you taking control of your own state rather than letting the environment control it. This is the silence of self-mastery, the silence Nietzsche most respected, where you demonstrate to yourself that you can remain sovereign even when everything around you is designed to destabilize you. The second tactical principle, timing determines effectiveness. Silence deployed too late, after you've already partially engaged, reads as withdrawal rather than choice. Silence deployed too early, before it's clear there's actually something to remain silent about, doesn't have impact. The precision weapon comes from timing. You watch, you observe, you wait for the exact moment when silence will have maximum effect, when the other person has just revealed something vulnerable, when they've just deployed a tactic, when they've just made a strong statement that they expect agreement on. That's when your silence lands with full force. Mastering this timing requires you to slow down your reaction speed dramatically. Most people react in milliseconds. Someone says something, you respond immediately. But this reaction speed prevents you from being strategic. You're operating on autopilot, on conditioning, on habit. Strategic silence requires you to introduce a gap. Someone says something. You don't respond immediately. You think. You assess. You decide consciously whether response serves your purpose. This gap might be just a few seconds, but those seconds are where power lives. The third tactical principle combines silence with presence. The silence we're discussing isn't absence or withdrawal. You're not leaving the conversation energetically while remaining physically present. You're staying absolutely present, absolutely attentive, but withholding verbal response. This creates a particular kind of tension that pure absence doesn't create. The person speaking can feel your attention. They know you're listening, but you're not giving them the validation of response. This combination of presence and silence is what creates the unsettling effect. If you're absent, they can dismiss your non-response as an attention. But when you're clearly present and still not responding, they have to grapple with why. Implementing this requires body language awareness. Maintain eye contact, but keep your expression neutral. Not hostile, not friendly. Neutral, not nodding in agreement. Not shaking your head in disagreement. Still, this stillness combined with attentiveness creates a mirror effect where the other person sees themselves reflected back without distortion or commentary. And as we've discussed, most people find their own unfiltered reflection deeply uncomfortable. The fourth tactical principle: know when to break the silence. Silence isn't an end in itself. It's a tool. And tools are used to achieve objectives, not deployed permanently. Strategic silence eventually breaks, but it breaks on your terms, at your chosen moment, for your chosen reason. Never because you were worn down, never because you couldn't stand the discomfort anymore, never because someone successfully made you feel guilty for not responding. When you break silence, it should be because you've decided that speaking now will achieve something valuable, not because you've been forced into speech. This breaking of silence is often where the most powerful impact occurs, because if you've maintained silence effectively, if you've created the psychological effects we've discussed, if you've put the other person through the discomfort of sustained stillness, then when you finally do speak, your words carry enormous weight. Everyone's attention focuses, the tension releases, and what you say lands with far more impact than if you'd been participating in normal back and forth the entire time. This is why sometimes the most strategic use of silence is as a way to load power into your eventual words. The longer the silence, the heavier the words that break it. The fifth tactical principle: be prepared for escalation. When you use silence effectively, especially with people accustomed to controlling you through a provoking response, they will escalate, will try harder, will deploy more extreme tactics, will attempt to make you feel so guilty or angry or defensive that you break the silence just to make the discomfort stop. This escalation is actually a sign that your silence is working, that their normal tactics are failing, that they're feeling desperate to restore the familiar dynamic. If you can maintain silence through escalation, if you can weather the storm of their intensified efforts to make you respond, you'll reach a turning point. Either they'll exhaust themselves and give up, or they'll have to deal with you as someone who can't be manipulated through provocation. Either outcome is a win for you. The sixth tactical principle: use silence to reclaim your energy. Every response you give is energy spent. Every time you explain, defend, justify, argue, you're expending your resources, often on people and situations that don't deserve that expenditure. Strategic silence is partly about energy conservation, about recognizing that your attention, your emotional energy, your time, these are finite resources, and you get to choose where they go. Silence is choosing not to spend these resources on unworthy targets, not to feed energy vampires, not to participate in draining dynamics. This isn't coldness. It's stewardship, taking responsibility for your own energy and refusing to let others drain it through baiting you into response. And finally, the seventh tactical principle: combine silence with self-observation. Every time you choose silence, especially in a situation where you want to respond, watch what happens inside you. What sensations arise? What thoughts emerge? What stories your mind tells about what your silence means? This internal observation is crucial because it shows you the conditioning that's been controlling you, shows you the beliefs that make silence uncomfortable, shows you the parts of your ego that need others' responses to feel secure. And seeing these patterns is the first step to freeing yourself from them. As you implement these tactical principles, as you transform silence from an abstract concept into a practiced skill, you will notice profound changes, not just in how others interact with you, though that will change dramatically, but in how you experience yourself. You'll feel more powerful because you are more powerful. You'll feel more sovereign because you've stopped giving your sovereignty away through compulsive response. You'll feel more centered because you're no longer being pulled into every drama, argument, and provocation that comes your way. You'll have become the master of your own responses rather than a puppet dancing on strings you couldn't see. And that mastery, that lived experience of choosing rather than being chosen for, that's what transforms silence from a mere absence of speech into a precision weapon that cuts through illusions, exposes truths, and establishes your position without you ever needing to announce it. Because when you've truly mastered strategic silence, your presence speaks volumes, and your stillness commands respect in ways that talking never could. Chapter 7. Stop being used while thinking you're keeping peace. There's a particular type of silence that masquerades as wisdom, but is actually submission. A silence that presents itself as maturity, but is really fear. A silence that claims to be choosing battles wisely, but is actually avoiding all battles, because confrontation feels unbearable. This chapter is going to be uncomfortable, because it's going to force you to examine whether your silence is strategic strength or conditioned weakness, whether you're wielding silence as a weapon or whether silence has become your prison. Let's start with brutal honesty. How often do you remain silent because you are genuinely choosing stillness from a position of power? And how often are you silent because you're afraid of what will happen if you speak? How often is your peace actually peace? And how often is it just the absence of active conflict achieved by making yourself smaller, quieter, more accommodating than you actually want to be? This distinction matters enormously. Strategic silence, the silence we've been discussing, comes from abundance, from having so much internal security that you don't need external validation, from being so clear about your position that you don't need others to agree with it, from being so confident in your worth that you don't need to defend it. This silence is a choice, an active decision, a positioning of power. But there's another kind of silence, the silence of scarcity, of fear, of someone who's been so conditioned to avoid conflict, to maintain harmony, to keep the peace at any cost, that they've confused their self-suppression with virtue. This silence isn't chosen. It's compelled. It comes from a deep belief that speaking up will lead to catastrophic consequences. Rejection, abandonment, conflict you couldn't handle. So you stay quiet. Not because you want to, because you're afraid of what happens if you don't. Nietzsche had a term for this: slave morality. The moral framework of people who've been subjugated so thoroughly that they've turned their powerlessness into a virtue, who call their inability to assert themselves keeping the peace, who label their fear of conflict being the bigger person, who describe their acceptance of disrespect, choosing love over ego. It's not virtue. It's coping. It's making a prison cell feel like a choice, so the imprisonment feels less unbearable. And here's the tragic part. Others can sense this distinction even when you can't. People know the difference between someone who's silent from strength and someone who's silent from weakness. They might not consciously articulate it, but at some level, they recognize that your silence isn't choice. It's fear. And fear invites exploitation. Not always maliciously, but predictably. Because people naturally expand into available space. And if your silence comes from an inability to set boundaries, from a fear of asserting yourself, from a desperate need to avoid conflict, then you're creating space that others will expand into, will occupy, will dominate, while you tell yourself you're being mature by not making an issue of it. Look at your relationships honestly. How many times have you let things slide that shouldn't have slid? How many times have you swallowed anger that needed to be expressed? How many times have you accepted treatment that violated your boundaries while convincing yourself it wasn't that bad? How many times have you prioritized someone else's comfort over your own dignity? If the answer makes you uncomfortable, if you're recognizing a pattern of choosing peace over self-respect, then you need to confront an ugly truth. Your silence isn't strategic. It's a symptom of exactly what Nietzsche identified as the sickness of modern humans, the inability to assert will, the fear of one's own power, the domestication that makes you easier to control. This is particularly insidious because our culture celebrates this kind of silence, calls it emotional intelligence, maturity, being the bigger person, taking the high road. All these phrases that make submission sound like enlightenment. But examine what's actually happening. Someone disrespects you. You don't respond. Is that because you've chosen not to waste energy on someone beneath your concern? Or is it because you're afraid of the confrontation that response would create? The former is strength. The latter is weakness disguised as virtue. The test is simple. If you remain silent by choice, you feel powerful afterward. Centered. Clear. Like you just demonstrated mastery. But if you remain silent from fear, you feel diminished afterward, angry at yourself, replaying what you should have said, feeling violated and powerless. That feeling is information. It's telling you that what just happened wasn't strategic silence. It was enforced suppression. And if this pattern repeats regularly, you're not keeping peace. You're training people to disrespect you. Here's what makes this particularly dangerous. Habitual suppressive silence doesn't stay contained. It spreads. You start out suppressing response to major violations because you don't want conflict. Then you start suppressing response to minor violations because the pattern is established. Eventually, you're suppressing so much that you barely have a voice at all. Your preferences don't matter. Your boundaries don't exist. Your needs are never expressed. You've become a ghost in your own life, present physically but absent in every meaningful way. And the worst part, you've probably convinced yourself this is noble, selfless, mature. It's not. It's self-abandonment. Nietzsche saw this pattern everywhere in the morality of his time. People who'd been taught that self-sacrifice is the highest virtue. That putting others first is what good people do. That having needs, boundaries, standards, these are all signs of ego that need to be transcended. But this teaching, Nietzsche argued, wasn't about actual virtue. It was about control, about creating a population that's easy to manage because they've been conditioned to suppress their own will, silence their own voice, betray their own interests, all while feeling virtuous for doing so. And if this describes you, if you recognize yourself in this pattern, the first step is admitting it, not with shame, with clarity. You've been operating from fear disguised as virtue. You've been choosing the comfort of avoiding conflict over the discomfort of asserting yourself. You've been prioritizing others' comfort over your own dignity. And this pattern has consequences. Consequences in how others treat you. Consequences in how you feel about yourself. Consequences in the accumulation of resentment that builds when you consistently betray your own needs. The second step is distinguishing between appropriate boundaries and unnecessary conflict. Because the insight here isn't that you should confront everything, challenge everyone, make every violation a battle. That would just be replacing one dysfunction with another. The insight is that you need to know the difference between strategic non-engagement and fearful avoidance, between choosing not to engage because it doesn't serve you and not engaging because you're afraid of the consequences of engagement. This requires developing what Nietzsche called the will to power, not power over others, but power over yourself. The ability to assert your will when assertion is necessary, to set boundaries when boundaries are violated, to speak when silence would be self-betrayal. This isn't about being aggressive or domineering. It's about refusing to be a doormat, about recognizing that healthy relationships can handle disagreement, conflict, assertion of needs. And relationships that can't handle these things aren't healthy relationships worth preserving through your self-suppression. The third step is practicing assertion in small ways. If you've spent years being suppressive silent, suddenly trying to assert yourself in major ways will feel impossible. You'll revert to pattern at the first sign of discomfort. So start small. Practice saying no to minor requests. Practice expressing preferences about little things. Practice setting small boundaries. Build the muscle of assertion in contexts where the stakes are low. And as that muscle strengthens, as you see that assertion doesn't lead to the catastrophic outcomes you feared, you can gradually assert in larger ways. But be prepared. Assertion will feel wrong at first. Your conditioning will scream that you're being selfish, aggressive, difficult, problematic. This is your slave morality protesting. It's been keeping you safe through submission. Now you're threatening that safety by standing up. The discomfort you feel isn't evidence you're doing something wrong. It's evidence you're breaking a pattern that's been controlling you. Push through. The discomfort is temporary. The freedom on the other side is permanent. Also be prepared for others to react negatively to your newfound assertion. People who've been benefiting from your suppressive silence won't like that you've started speaking up. They'll try to guilt you back into silence. You used to be so easygoing. I don't know what's gotten into you. You're being really difficult lately. These statements aren't accurate assessments. They're attempts to restore the dynamic that worked for them. Don't fall for it. Your assertion isn't the problem. Their expectation that you'd suppress yourself forever was the problem. The final truth of this chapter is harsh but necessary. If you continue choosing suppressive silence, continue avoiding conflict at the cost of self-respect, continue keeping peace by making yourself smaller, you will build resentment. Deep, corrosive resentment that poisons your relationships and your sense of self. Because humans aren't meant to suppress their will indefinitely. We're not designed to endlessly accommodate others while neglecting ourselves. Eventually, the suppressed material erupts, either as explosive anger that damages relationships, or as depression that damages you, or as quiet, bitter resentment that leaks out in passive-aggressive ways. Better to learn the difference between strategic silence and suppressive silence now. Better to develop the ability to assert when assertion is necessary. Better to become someone who chooses peace from strength rather than accepts peace from weakness. Because the peace you achieve through self-betrayal isn't real peace. It's just the temporary absence of conflict purchased at the price of your dignity. And that's a price Nietzsche would say no self-respecting person should ever pay. Stop being used while thinking you're keeping peace. Start asserting yourself strategically, and discover that real peace, the kind that lasts, comes not from avoiding conflict, but from being able to handle it without losing yourself in the process. Chapter 8. The Übermensch and the Silence that Commands Respect. We've reached the culmination of Nietzsche's philosophy as it relates to silence. The Übermensch, often translated as Overman or Superman, represents the highest evolution of human consciousness, not in a physical sense, in a psychological and philosophical sense. The Übermensch has transcended the limitations that bind ordinary humans, transcended the need for external validation, transcended reactive behavior, transcended slave morality, and crucially for our discussion, the Übermensch has mastered silence in its most powerful form. Silence is the natural state of someone who has nothing to prove to anyone. Understanding the Übermensch requires understanding what Nietzsche saw as the sickness of modern humanity. Most people, in his view, live as slaves to morality they didn't create, to values they inherited from culture, religion, family, society. They spend their lives trying to be good according to standards set by others, seeking approval according to metrics they didn't choose, playing a game where the rules were established before they were born and which they never questioned. This is psychological slavery. Comfortable slavery perhaps, but slavery nonetheless. The Übermensch breaks these chains, creates their own values, establishes their own standards, lives according to self-generated principles rather than inherited ones. This doesn't mean sociopathy, doesn't mean rejecting all conventional morality just for the sake of rejection. It means examining every belief, every value, every principle you hold and asking, do I actually believe this? Or am I just accepting it because it's what I was taught? The Übermensch keeps what passes this test, discards what doesn't, and ends up with a value system that's genuinely theirs rather than just borrowed. But what does this have to do with silence? Everything. Because the Übermensch doesn't need to convince anyone else that their values are correct, doesn't need to defend their principles, doesn't need to argue for their worldview. They've determined what they believe through rigorous self-examination. They live according to those beliefs, and whether anyone else agrees is profoundly irrelevant to them. This creates a particular kind of silence, the silence of someone who has nothing to prove, because they're not seeking validation from those they've transcended. This is the silence that commands respect, not the silence of someone too afraid to speak, not the silence of someone calculating strategy. The silence of someone operating at a level where others' opinions simply don't register as important. Imagine being so secure in your values, so clear about your purpose, so certain of your path that criticism just bounces off, not because you're defending against it, but because it's coming from people playing a different game with different rules that you've stopped playing entirely. This is terrifying to most people, because the majority of human interaction is based on the shared assumption that everyone cares about everyone else's opinion. Everyone's seeking approval, avoiding disapproval, trying to manage their reputation. The entire social fabric depends on mutual participation in this validation economy. But the Übermensch has left that economy, stopped trading in the currency of others' approval. And this exit from the shared game of validation seeking is what makes their silence so powerful. They're not withholding response as a tactic. They simply have no need for response because the entire framework that makes response seem necessary has been transcended. Watch what happens when an Übermensch figure enters a social situation. Others can sense immediately that this person is different. They're not performing, not managing their image, not carefully calibrating what they say to generate specific reactions. They speak when they have something worth saying. They're silent when they don't. And most importantly, they show no signs of caring how their words or silence are received. This authenticity, this complete lack of performance, is magnetic. People are drawn to it because it's so rare. Most people are performing constantly. Meeting someone who isn't creates a hunger to to be near that authenticity, to learn from it, to perhaps achieve it yourself. But here's the paradox. You can't become an Übermensch by trying to be one. Can't fake this level of transcendence. Others sense the difference between someone genuinely operating from self-generated values versus someone performing non-caring as a strategy. The Übermensch doesn't think about commanding respect. Respect comes naturally as a byproduct of their authentic way of being. The moment you're strategizing about how to command respect through silence, you're still playing the validation game, still caring about others' perceptions, still enslaved to the very system you're trying to transcend. So how does one actually become an Übermensch? Nietzsche was frustratingly vague about specifics, which is probably intentional, because the path to Übermensch status is intensely personal. What worked for one person won't work for another. But we can identify general principles that seem necessary for this evolution. First, radical self-honesty. You must examine every belief you hold and trace its origin. Was this belief formed through your own experience and reasoning? Or was it inherited? Was it adopted to fit in, to be accepted, to avoid rejection? Most of what you believe probably falls into the inherited category. The work of becoming an Übermensch involves questioning all of it, not necessarily rejecting it, but genuinely examining whether you actually believe it or are just parroting cultural programming. Second, willingness to stand alone. The process of creating your own values, of living according to principles you've generated rather than inherited, will separate you from the herd. Most people won't understand. Many will criticize. Some will try to pull you back into conventional thinking. The Übermensch must be able to endure this isolation without breaking, without compromising, without seeking the comfort of agreement from those operating at levels they've transcended. This is where most people fail. The isolation becomes unbearable. They retreat back into conventional morality for the comfort of belonging. Third, a more fatty love of fate. The Übermensch doesn't just accept what happens. They love it, all of it. The painful parts, the difficult parts, the parts that break other people, because they recognize that their strength comes through difficulty. Their wisdom comes through suffering. Their growth comes through challenge. This isn't masochism. It's the recognition that the very experiences most people try to avoid are the ones that forge the strongest character. So the Übermensch doesn't just endure difficulty. They embrace it as necessary for becoming who they're meant to become. Fourth, eternal recurrence. Nietzsche proposed a thought experiment. What if you had to live your exact life over and over for eternity? Same choices, same outcomes, same experiences. Would you want that? The person living according to borrowed values, according to others' expectations, according to paths they didn't choose. That person is horrified by the thought. But the Übermensch would embrace it, because they're living so authentically, so aligned with self-generated values, so fully in accord with their own nature, that living it repeatedly would be joyful rather than torturous. This is the test. Are you living in a way that you'd choose again if you had to? If not, why not? These principles create a particular kind of person, someone who's done such deep internal work that external opinions become nearly irrelevant. Someone who's so clear about their own values that defending them to others seems pointless. Someone who's so comfortable in their own skin that performing for others feels unnecessary. And this person's silence is qualitatively different from normal silence. It's not withholding, not strategy, not fear. It's the natural state of someone who has nothing to prove, because they've transcended the entire game of proving, defending, justifying, explaining. This silence commands respect because it comes from a place of such obvious strength. The Übermensch isn't staying silent to manipulate. They're silent because they've reached a level of development where constant verbalization of thoughts, constant explanation of positions, constant defense of choices seems juvenile. They live their values. That's enough. Whether anyone understands or agrees is not their concern. Not because they don't care about people, but because they recognize that each person must walk their own path to this kind of self-knowledge. Can't be argued into it. Can't be explained into it. Must experience it directly or not at all. And this is what makes the Übermensch philosophy so challenging, because it offers no shortcuts, no techniques you can mimic to fake the state, no tactics that will make you appear more evolved than you actually are. It demands genuine transformation, genuine confrontation with yourself, genuine evolution of consciousness, and that work is hard, harder than learning any technique or strategy or tactic. It requires you to question everything, potentially lose everything, and rebuild yourself from the ground up according to principles you determine through your own examination of existence. But for those who undertake this work, for those who genuinely evolve toward Übermensch consciousness, the silence that naturally emerges commands respect not through any effort to command it, but simply through the obvious presence of someone operating at a level most people haven't imagined is possible. Someone who's broken free of the psychological chains that bind ordinary humans. Someone who's created themselves rather than accepting the self that culture tried to create for them. Someone who lives so authentically that their silence speaks more truthfully than most people's words ever could. That's the Übermensch. That's the silence that commands respect. And that's the ultimate goal Nietzsche points toward. Not better tactics for winning arguments, but evolution beyond the need to engage in arguments at all. Conclusion: the silence that wins without fighting. We've traveled far in this exploration of silence as power, from understanding why your need to respond exposes weakness, through the psychology of how silence unsettles others, to the tactics of using silence strategically, and finally to the Übermensch consciousness, where silence emerges naturally from transcendent self-knowledge. Now, we must bring all of this together into a coherent understanding you can actually implement in your life. The central insight is this: true power is not found in words, but in their absence. Not in what you say, but in what you choose not to say. Not in winning arguments, but in transcending the need to argue at all. This reverses everything modern culture teaches about communication and power. Culture says speak up, be heard, make your voice loud. But Nietzsche recognized that the loudest voice is often the weakest, that those who must constantly assert themselves are revealing exactly how insecure their position actually is. Real strength shows itself in stillness, in the ability to hear criticism and remain unmoved, in the capacity to watch others perform and not feel compelled to join, in the power to let misunderstandings remain uncorrected because your self-knowledge doesn't depend on others' accurate understanding of you. This strength isn't innate. It's developed through practice, through repeatedly choosing silence when your conditioning screams for response, through building the muscle of self-possession until it becomes your default state rather than an achievement. But as we've explored, not all silence is equal. The silence of fear is weakness. The silence of strategic withholding is power. The silence of the Übermensch is transcendence. You must become clear about which silence you're practicing. If your silence comes from fear of consequences, from avoiding conflict because you can't handle it, from suppressing yourself to keep others comfortable, then you're not practicing power. You're practicing submission. And no amount of philosophical justification transforms submission into strength. The transformation requires confronting yourself brutally, asking whether you're choosing silence or being silenced, whether you're withholding response from strength or from fear, whether you're transcending the need for validation or just pretending not to need it while secretly dying for acknowledgement. This honesty is painful. Most people avoid it, prefer to believe they're being strategic when they're actually just being controlled. But if you want genuine power through silence, self-deception has to die. You must see yourself clearly, including the uncomfortable parts, especially the uncomfortable parts. Once you've established that your silence comes from genuine choice, from self-possession rather than fear, the implementation becomes straightforward. You practice. You notice situations where you'd normally respond and pause instead. You feel the discomfort of not responding and sit with it rather than acting to relieve it. You watch what happens when you withhold expected reactions, both in yourself and in others. You learn to read the psychological dynamics that emerge in silence, and you gradually build a completely different relationship to conversation, to conflict, to social interaction. This new relationship fundamentally changes your life, because suddenly you're no longer reactable. People can't push your buttons, because you've disconnected the buttons from your behavior. They can't manipulate you through guilt, because you've recognized guilt as just a feeling that doesn't mandate specific actions. They can't provoke you into unwise responses, because you've created a gap between stimulus and response where wisdom can operate. You become like water flowing around obstacles rather than crashing against them. Not passive, not weak, but strategically fluid in ways that rigid reactivity never achieves. And as this transformation deepens, as silence becomes your natural state more than constant verbalization, you will notice others responding to you differently. Some will find you intimidating, though you've done nothing intimidating. Some will project all kinds of qualities onto you, both positive and negative, though you've simply been quiet. Some will feel uncomfortable in your presence, because your silence forces them to confront themselves. And a rare few will recognize what you've achieved and respect you deeply for it. This respect, this new way of being met by others, isn't the goal. It's a byproduct. The actual goal is self-mastery, is internal sovereignty, is the capacity to remain centered regardless of external chaos. The respect that comes is just evidence that you've achieved something real, that your silence isn't performance, but transformation, that you've genuinely evolved beyond the reactive patterns that govern most human behavior. But remember, this is a practice, not a destination. You won't perfect it. You'll have moments where you react when you're meant to remain still, where you break silence prematurely, where old patterns reassert themselves. This doesn't mean failure. It means you're human. The practice is in noticing these moments, learning from them, and returning to conscious choice rather than automatic reaction. Over time, the conscious choice becomes more automatic than the reaction used to be. But it's always practice, always refinement, always the ongoing work of becoming who you're capable of being. The world needs more people practicing this path. More individuals who've mastered themselves enough that they can't be easily manipulated. More humans who've developed the strength to remain silent in the face of provocation. More consciousness capable of watching the theater of ego without feeling compelled to join the performance. Because the world is full of noise, full of reactive behavior, full of people trapped in stimulus response patterns they don't even recognize as patterns. And every person who breaks free from these patterns, who masters silence as tool and as state of being, creates a small island of genuine power in an ocean of false power that's really just uncontrolled reactivity wearing a mask of strength. So the invitation is clear. Begin. Begin noticing your compulsions to respond. Begin questioning whether those responses serve you. Begin practicing the pause between stimulus and response. Begin distinguishing between strategic silence and fearful suppression. Begin doing the internal work of examining your beliefs, your values, your patterns. Begin evolving towards self-generated rather than inherited ways of being. Begin the journey toward the kind of silence that commands respect, not because it's demanding anything, but because it's emanating from someone who's transcended the need to demand. This journey is yours alone. No one can walk it for you. No technique can shortcut the genuine transformation required. No strategy can fake the consciousness that makes powerful silence natural. But the journey is possible. Others have walked it. Nietzsche mapped it. And now you've been shown the map. What happens next depends entirely on whether you have the courage to confront yourself, the discipline to practice against your conditioning, and the patience to let transformation unfold at its own pace rather than forcing it according to your timeline. The weak shout. The strong remain silent. The wise choose when to do each. And now you understand not just what this means intellectually, but how to implement it practically, psychologically, strategically. You understand that silence isn't absence, but presence. Isn't emptiness, but fullness. Isn't weakness, but the ultimate expression of strength. You understand that winning doesn't require fighting when you've mastered the art of presence that makes fighting unnecessary. Your move, your choice, your evolution, the silence that wins without fighting is waiting for you to claim it. Not someday. Now, in the next conversation where you feel the urge to react, in the next provocation that tries to hook you, in the next moment where your conditioning says speak and your wisdom says wait. That's where power lives. In that pause, in that gap, in that silence. Master it. Master yourself. And discover that everything else you've been seeking through words was actually there all along, waiting in the profound power of chosen, strategic, transcendent silence.